So in this video, I'm going to show you how to run your Anova using StatCrunch. So we've already have our two independent variables with two levels each. In this case, we have mindfulness and flow, and people are either high in mindfulness, low in mindfulness, or high in flow, low in flow. And then our dependent variable, which is how happy they are. So we're going to run a two-factor Anova. To do that, you go to Stat, Anova, two-way, meaning that we have two independent variables. And then for our responses in, that's our dependent variable, we want to select happy AVG. And it's actually the only one that we have here because that's the only one that's a numerical variable. So just put your dependent variable in that one. And then for your row and column factor, it doesn't matter which one you put in there first, but that's where you want to put your independent variables. In whatever order you do, it doesn't really matter. And then just click Plot Interactions, so it'll create some nice graphs for us, and Display Means Table. So after you have that set up, you have your DV, your two IVs, and these two boxes checked off. Just hit Compute. It'll come up with a nice display here of all of our effects, as well as two graphs to display our effects. And so to explain some of this, basically to figure out if we have any main effects or interactions, you want to check out the p-values right here. And so for this one, you look at it one factor at a time. So basically, does mindfulness have any effect on happiness? In this case, it doesn't because our p-value is above a 0.05. So we'd say there's no main effect for mindfulness. Whereas for flow, this is actually very close. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this was significant. It would actually have to be 0.054 for it to be significant, because this would round up to 0.06. But this is very close. So in this case, we might say, for example, that flow does have a main effect on happiness if this was a little bit lower. And as for an interaction, there's no interaction here between flow and mindfulness on happiness because, again, this is at or above, or it's above 0.05. So here it's a 0.4. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that there was a significant interaction. The easiest way to see that would be to look at the plot right here. And it actually plots it in two ways. It plots one with mindfulness on the x-axis and flow with different lines. And here's the same results, but this time flow is on the x-axis and mindfulness is on different lines. So you can use either of these plots in terms of your poster. You just want to pick the one that makes the most sense to you. So let's say this was a significant interaction. What this would mean basically is that those who are high in mindfulness, if they also have high flow, they tend to be a lot happier than if they have low flow. So here it's sort of a combination. If this was significant, we'd say something like, is those participants who had high mindfulness and high flow who benefited the most had the highest in mindfulness. But if they had high mindfulness, then they actually suffered if they had low flow in terms of happiness. Whereas in this case, over on this side of the graph, if they were low mindfulness, they still benefited from having high flow, but not quite as much. And also they didn't suffer as much for having the low flow with low mindfulness. So in other words, you could come up with some story about that, why that might be the case. For example, maybe low flow is more detrimental to happiness when you're more mindful of it, when you're more aware that you're not enjoying your work, for instance, which is an indicator of low flow. But high flow is even better for your happiness because, again, you're more mindful of the fact that you're enjoying and really invested in your work. So you can make up a story as to why there might be an interaction. But that's, of course, only if there actually is an interaction. In this case, there wasn't because it's non-significant. So that's how you perform the analysis and kind of interpret some of this information. And then when you want to figure out your means and standard deviations, that's all right here. So basically our means, well, it doesn't show standard deviations, but our means for each group, this is like for people who are high mindfulness, high flow, they scored the highest in happiness. People who are high mindfulness, low flow, scored the lowest in happiness. And then in parentheses are how many participants we have in each of these cells. And over in these columns, these are basically the total for high mindfulness and the total for low mindfulness compared to each other. And as you can see, there really wasn't much of a difference there, which makes sense because this wasn't a significant effect. But if you see for high and low flow, you actually get a pretty big difference of about a 0.5 on a 10-point scale. And that makes sense, again, because this one was very nearly significant. So that's reflected in the totals right here. And then the total for everyone on average is this one right here. And you can see that we had 64 people in this entire data set. So that's how to interpret this graph down here. So if we were going to write this up, let me put this over here and open up a little Word document. You would want to first talk about your main effects. So you would say, for example, a Factorial Anova was run assessing the effects of mindfulness and flow on happiness. It was found that there was no main effect of mindfulness on happiness. In that one, you don't need to put any statistics because basically there was no effect found. But let's go ahead and pretend that this is significant because it's so close. So we could say, however, it was found that those with high flow were happier than those with low flow. So with this one, we need to put in stats if this is significant. And you first want to start out with the mean and standard deviation of those who are high and low flow. And for here, we're just going to put in the means because that's all that's provided for us. We'll get the standard deviations later. So it's found that those with high flow are happier, and that'd be a good place to put in the mean for that group, than those with low flow, and that'll be the mean for that group. And so right here, the mean for people who are high flow is 4.66. Put it in 4.66. And those for low flow was 4.13. We always want to round that to the 100th place. And then we want to put in our statistics for this, and that's going to include our F values and our degrees of freedom. And first we're going to start off with an F value, because this is an F test. And to put in our degrees of freedom, you want to put that in parentheses. And there's going to be actually two numbers here. So you first want to start with the df, degrees of freedom, for the actual variable that you have. So in this case, it's flow, and the df for that is 1. And then for the other variable, you also want to put in the df for the error. And that's the other one you're going to do for each of the main effects or interactions. You always put in the error second. In this case, it's 60. And then you put in equal sign, and you want to put in the actual F statistic, in this case for flow, which is 3.83, rounded up. And then finally the p-value. In this case, we'll pretend that this is 0.054. So we'll put in p is equal to 0.05. Now, if p was really below this, let's say it was said, below 0.0001, then you just put as p is less than 0.01, because you can only ever round to the 100th place. And so the other thing we want to do is just italicize all the statistical acronyms here. And then in this case, let's go ahead and pretend that we had a significant interaction here, so we can kind of write about it. And let's say it was also found that there was a significant interaction between mindfulness and flow on happiness. In this case, you don't have to worry about putting any means and standard deviations, but you want to put those statistics at the end. In this case, it's another F test. The df is again 1 in this case, because it says interaction df1. The same error would be 60. And the F statistic for this one, it's too low to be significant. We'll just put it in there anyway. It's 0.71. And let's just pretend that the p equals, 0.05 again. So for this one, you first want to just state that it's significant, if it is. But then you want to add some kind of information about what it looks like. So in this case, we'll go to this graph right here. And we could say something like, let's see, we'll put in here, in which people of high mindfulness showed much higher happiness if they were also high in flow, but much lower happiness if they were low in flow compared to those of low mindfulness. So it's a bit complicated. You can explain it any which way you want, but that's one interpretation of it. So basically, flow had a bigger effect on happiness if people were high in mindfulness. And in fact, you could, this is one way to phrase it. Maybe that's a simpler way. You just go in which flow had a stronger effect on happiness in those who possessed high mindfulness. And then in the discussion section, you can kind of explain why. Maybe flow had a bigger effect on those who were high in mindfulness because people noticed their flow more if they were high in mindfulness, for instance. But anyway, you just want some little description of what that effect is. And then you finish it by putting in figure 1, because that's where you're going to put in this plot right here. So let's say you have this all drawn up. What you're going to then do to put in figure 1 is you're going to start a new page. So on Windows, it would be Control-Enter, and on Mac, it's Command-Shift-Enter to start a new page. And you especially don't want to just go enter, 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 enter until you get to the bottom, because then if you edit anything up here, it'll actually screw up your graph down there. So always do Command-Shift-Enter on a Mac or Control-Enter on a Windows. And then just do this where you go Options, Copy, and then right-click it, go Copy Image, and go over here and go and paste that image in there. And you can go Paste Special and make sure Picture is selected. There we go. And then you just want to put a little caption on the bottom. This will be in italics, figure 1, period. And then the actual title is not in italics, and just say interaction between then your two variables, which in this case would be mindfulness and flow on happiness. And you don't need to italicize this. This stays unitalicized, but in the actual figure, it's italicized. And this is always going to go on its own page. So there you go. There's a short version of a write-up for two main effects in an interaction. And in this case, there's the figure for that interaction.